Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexei, and today I have a special guest, Joey Sturgis. Joey is a wonderful metal sound engineer who has been working with such great bands as Attack, Asking Alexandria, Of Mice and Men, Oceano, and many more. Also, Joey is a co-founder of Nail the Mix, online metal production academy, and he is a founder of Joey Sturgis Tones plugins company. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel today, Joey. And let's start our interview. And the first question is how you became a sound engineer.
Well, I actually became a sound engineer by accident. I started off like most people playing in a band. Like if you're in music, you probably started playing in a band when you're in your teenager years. And I actually started earlier than most people. I started like when I was 9. So I was in a band of a bunch of 25-year-olds, and I was like a 9-year-old drummer in that band. So it was kind of awkward, but we played like a lot of shows. And I grew up with those people. Some of them were my cousins. And my whole family is musical. Everyone either plays guitar or plays keyboard, or they sing or they do something musical. So the thing that was weird about this, though, is I always wanted to be like a computer programmer. I was more interested in programming video games and programming websites and things like that. But I, of course, always had some kind of involvement in music. And long story short is that I was the drummer in this band, and we wanted to play more shows. And this is like in my early 20s, or my late teen years into my early 20s. And our idea was we could just record ourselves, put the demo on MySpace, and then people would hear what we sound like, and then they would want to play shows with us. So my friend had a garage, a detached garage at his house, and he had like all this gear in there, and they used it as sort of like their band headquarters. And he was much older than me, but he worked like a really weird shift. So there's like a large portion of the day where he wouldn't be there because he would just be asleep. And so during that time, I'd be like, hey, since nobody's using your studio at that time, can I jump in there and just mess around? Like, I won't delete any of your songs or anything, but I just want to play around. So I did that and got pretty good, and ended up recording our demo. We put it on MySpace, and then people were just like, instead of asking to play shows with us, they were asking like where we recorded. They wanted to record the same place that we recorded. And we're like, what? So it just became like a thing where we're like, okay, well, maybe we can just like record the bands, and then like while we're recording them, we can like kind of convince them to do a show with us. And of course, it never really worked out because the bands that were coming through were like bands that we didn't really want to play shows with. And then it turned into a whole other thing. And then eventually, like, I recorded a band that got signed, and then it kind of just like, it's hard to tell the story like in full detail, but if you can imagine, it's just me sort of not knowing what to do with my time and just kind of messing around with the computer, figuring out how like EQs and compressors work with trial and error, bands coming in. I'm just trying to make their stuff sound better. And then eventually I become like an engineer. So it's kind of a weird thing that ended up happening to me, but I ended up sort of getting into it more and more the further I went down the rabbit hole. And yeah, that's how I became an engineer.
How you got into mix and metal?
Well, I have always liked aggressive music. I really do have to give credit to my cousin Ryan, because he's several years older than I am. And so he was really influential in what I would listen to at a young age, because I would spend a lot of time with my cousins and my aunts and uncles and things like that. So, he introduced me to Meshuggah, but like before anyone else even really knew who they were, because he was like always sort of like listening to the next thing. And me being the age I was and having exposure to that style of music at that age enabled me to like kind of fast track to like more advanced styles of metal and more obscure styles of metal that were going to eventually make an impact on the metal scene. I mean, I was listening to like Meshuggah when I was like 13 or something. So as I got older, I was able to see into different genres and different spaces where I was like, okay, I see what they're doing. They're taking, like death metal, but they're mixing it with like this this like symphonic kind of thing. So let me do this. And just basically have always loved metal. I've always resonated with it. I played in metal bands. It's just been a part of my life. And a funny story related to metal genre in general is that I had this friend after high school who would always try to show me these bands. And one of the bands he tried to show me was Slipknot. And I remember hearing Slipknot and just being like, oh, I hate this. Like, this is awful. And then like 2 months later, I listened to it again and I was like, oh my God, this is the best band ever. So it just goes to show you like how quickly, things were changing and how quickly like I was changing as a music listener. Slipknot is still one of my all-time favorite bands, but when I first heard them, I was not a fan when I first heard their record.
How you got your first metal clients for mixing?
Yeah, well, I started off kind of doing like, I guess, rock bands. And then, obviously my band was not a rock band. My band was like a grindcore band. So I was on like both ends of the spectrum. Like I played I recorded a really like radio forward, like rock band with like only singing. And then I also recorded my band, which was just only screaming and like blast beats. And then, putting that up on MySpace made lots of different inquiries come to me. So I had like pop punk bands, I had like hardcore bands. So after like doing five or six of those and putting those up online, it kind of attracted like a wide variety of music, but it was all still in the aggressive zone. So the thing about it is when you record like a band that is active, they'll go out and play shows and they'll talk to other bands, and sometimes those bands will be completely different from them. Like it'd be a pop punk band talking to a metal band or vice versa. But I had such an impact, I guess, on their music that they sort of felt compelled to like tell other bands about what I was doing. They were like, this guy is like on a different level. He's, really meticulous and really detailed with how he records. You should go see if you can work with him. So I had like almost like a referral marketing thing happening for me as those bands were out and about playing shows with each other. And during those times when metal was sort of like innovating a little bit, there was a lot of shows where you had a huge mixture of different genres, or even a huge mixture of subgenres. So like it was great for me because I was just, 1 minute I'm recording a sort of a pop punk band that has like 3 or 4 piece harmonies, and then the next minute I'm doing like Oceano or something. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
So my next question is why you decided to run your own YouTube channel if you already are making videos for Nail the Mix?
Well, Nail the Mix offers a different type of education that requires sort of a certain level of focus. I think the type of people that use Nail the Mix as a learning tool are the type of people who are really focused on developing their own skill set, really trying to be someone who is being a full-time mixing engineer, someone who's really in it to build a career. And Nail the Mix is perfect for that because it's long form content. A lot of those mixing sessions can be 6 to 8 hours long. That does not make sense to live on YouTube, especially because of the amount of money it takes to produce one of those episodes. It has to be a paid for service just to even make it happen, because we've got to pay the artist, we've got to pay the label, the publisher, the mixing engineer, the studio, all these different things that are incorporated into making one of those episodes happen. So, thankfully we found a user base that's willing to help us fund those episodes to make them happen. And then of course you get to learn from the world's best mixing engineers in the metal and rock genre, and hopefully other genres in the future. So, for me to make content on YouTube is more of just my own ability to educate people about the audio production process, the music production process for music creators of all kinds. Because now we're living in a time period where there's a lot of different kinds of music creators. There's some people who create music literally just because it's a part of their YouTube channel. And it's not necessarily the fact that they're a band or a touring band and they're making videos. It's more the other way around, where they're making videos and they kind of have a band, but it's more because they have the channel. And there's a wide variety of music creators within those two extremes, right? Like there's people who are guitar players that are in a band and they want to be able to just get good at making their own demos just so they can show their other band members their own ideas and they can make their ideas sound good. So because of that and the revolution of that I've seen in my own studio, which, you know, every time I work with somebody, it's like the person sitting next to me is not just a guitar player. Like they're messing around with GarageBand in their free time, or they're using Logic Pro for the first time. And they're asking me questions about plugins and EQs and compressors and all of this stuff. And so for me, it's just more of a conversation. It's like, I'm just trying to help those music creators get to their creations faster and more easily and have a better understanding of how they can better integrate with their own creativity. And I think that's really kind of the mission of what Joey Sturgis Tones has been all about. It's like, let me help this side of the industry by creating some really good tools that people can use to just get back into the music part of it, you know, and not have to be like this fucking scientist or engineer or whatever to like have to learn how to make their own demos and or even make their own final masters, you know. So it's kind of coming from a place of empowerment where I want to empower creators of all types. And I think Nail the Mix has like quite a large focus on mixing engineers working towards a career. And that's why it's a perfect product for that. And I think my free YouTube channel that's over here is a little bit more low budget on the production cost, but we can still provide like really great information and great value to music creators of all kinds.
So my next question is, why sound design is so important in modern metal production?
Well, metal production in its own, the definition of a metal production is kind of just a block of noise. And I don't mean that like in a harsh or critical or even a negative way. I mean it more just like in reality, what you're dealing with is a bunch of stuff that's all saturated and has tons of harmonics. And it's really hard to like make that sound pleasant because it's really just a lot of distortion, a lot of static, full frequency stuff. So sound design kind of breaks up the monotony of that. Like if you think of a metal mix as almost like a stream, it's like you've got a stream of kick drums, you've got a stream of guitars playing riffs, you've got a stream of screaming that's just holding out screams or layers of screams. It's like there's only so many of those patterns and combinations that you can have before the song starts to get boring or the album gets boring. And so sound design is interesting because it brings in a new layer of melody and atmosphere and vibe that can basically make the music more interesting than it would be on paper, or more interesting than it would be if it was just a 4-piece band. It's kind of like that way for the producer to be able to go, okay, I don't want to necessarily break up what's happening in the song here, and I don't want to introduce a new part because I don't want to make the song too complicated. So I can just add like atmosphere, I can add these melodies or these synths or these different sound effects that kind of like guide the listener from part to part or make this part separate from this other part. It's really just a great tool that I think more producers are starting to embrace. And at first it was kind of a tough sell for some metal bands because the metal bands would come in and they would have all this pride, like we play our own guitars, we play our own drum parts, and that's cool. And that has its own vibe. And there's a lot of bands that are like really great at doing that. And that's actually what you're coming to the band for. Like you want to hear those guys play the way they play. But there's a whole nother generation out there of listeners that want to have like a more heightened or maybe even more cinematic experience. And they want to hear some of their favorite bands with that level of production. And so I think it took a while to get some of these bands to like lighten up to the idea of having little things sprinkled on top of their hard work. Not everybody was open to it. I had to definitely talk to some bands and say, listen, I can record your album exactly as it is. You guys as a 4-piece, you guys as a 5-piece, just playing your instruments from beginning to end. But if we want to elevate this, if we want to put a little extra salt on top, we're going to need to add like some pads or some synths or some orchestra or some gunshots or some explosions, just a little thing to take it over the edge. And, fortunately I was lucky enough to work with some people that were open-minded enough to embrace those ideas, which kind of helped me develop my own style and get my name out there a little bit further.
So what tips can you give on creating a good low end in metal?
So controlling the low end in metal is a challenge from the start because a lot of the instruments are playing low notes and they're all in low octaves or low ranges, right? You've got some of these bands are freaking in drop E now, which is insane. So you've got like drop E or if you're an F or something, like you have a lot of frequencies below 100 hertz, and to get all of that stuff to work in a fashion that sounds good and doesn't sound like a bunch of mud, you really have to use a lot of what I call like auto processors. So things like multiband processors, like multiband compressors, multiband limiters, things like Soothe, which is kind of like a automatic EQ. Dynamic EQs are even good here. And you need to approach the problem with a strategy, which is basically like figure out where you're going to get your low end from and how are you going to like make the other elements that need low end, how are you going to make them all work and gel together. And it's almost a trade-off situation. I can give you an example. I was working on a song, I think it's in drop E, and in the song there's a bass synth, there's a bass guitar, there's low tuned drop E guitars, and there's also sub drops, and some other low end effects like explosions that have like actual rumbling low end. And to make all of these things work together, what we ended up doing is, we basically just created several different layers of track spacer, which is a really awesome plugin. I wish I had invented it, but I didn't. You can go check that out from, I think it's Waves Factory that makes it. But yeah, track spacer is amazing because you can sidechain it. So I could put track spacer on like on a bass guitar, and I could sidechain a bass drop into it. And so when that bass drop fires off, it's going to carve out some of that low end on that track of the bass. And so it allows the low end from the sub drop to come through. And so what you really ultimately fall into a pattern of is figuring out, where do I want my priorities to be? Do I want the bass guitar to basically have the highest priority, or do I want like the sub drop to have the high priority, or do I want it to have a medium level priority, et cetera, et cetera. And as soon as you figure out this priority list, you can organize it all, set up all your sends, and get that stuff happening for you automatically. And then to control sort of the low end of the entire mix itself, you're going to want some kind of dynamic EQ or a low band or multi-band compressor that is helping you push the low end back down when it gets past a certain threshold. And for that, I use like linear MB by Waves. It's a linear phase multi-band compressor, so it's really awesome to use for low end. And but you can get by with like all kinds of different things, like like a dynamic EQ is another way. It's not quite the same thing as a compressor, but will still help you control the low end. Or another good trick, and this is something you'll need to do when you start to get into like more wider reaching mixes or masters that are going to go out there and really get played on a lot of different devices. You're going to want to have some kind of processor that can take the low octave and then multiply it up on the higher octaves. And there's a bunch of different software out there that does this kind of thing, but I have a plugin called JST Maximizer that has low end enhancement, and it helps you bring those low harmonics back up into the mid range, so that when you're listening to it on a laptop or earbuds or smaller speakers, it can recreate those, basically what you should be hearing in the low end. It kind of recreates those in a different octave so that you still get to hear it even on small speakers. And so I highly recommend that anyone that's trying to control low end does a combination of those three things, right? The track spacer, the multi-band compression, and the low-end enhancement up into the upper harmonics.
Do you need to go to a college nowadays when you can get online education and nail the mix on sound engineering?
I think the answer to this kind of depends on the person, because I think there's in my mind, there's sort of two different styles of learning, or two different styles of the student, I should say. One student over here has like a desire to learn, and they also have like, the due diligence or the desire to like wake up every day and push themselves forward. They don't need like a schedule or an outline or like somebody to tell them to come to class. They just naturally want to do it. Meanwhile, the student over here, just as equally as could be as equally as successful as this student, they have more of a creative desire, but not necessarily the structure that's required to wake up and learn every day. They're not going to go out on their own and look up the definition of decibels or hertz, or learn how EQ filters work, or whatever. Like, that person just wants to make music, or they want to be good at making music, or whatever it is, right? So I think for this student here, the one that is willing to learn and can create a structure for themselves, that person is well off to never have to go to college, can find out all the information on their own, just use YouTube, books, nail the mix, things like this. And they're going to be just fine. But the person that requires some level of structure that they don't possess themselves, I think the college environment is a really good environment for that style of student, because, it's almost like you need, like, that kind of person needs somebody to kind of knock on the door and say, hey, don't forget, you got to go to class. Hey, don't forget, you need to learn about compression. Hey, don't forget, you got to do this, and that. And if they don't do those things if somebody's not there to tell them to do those things, then they're not going to do it on their own. And then they kind of never really get anywhere, and they just sort of run in an endless hamster wheel. So I don't write off college completely, because I think there's a style of person that it works for. But I think that there's also a style of person where, you don't really get challenged by college, because you can just challenge yourself. That's who I am. That's how I am. And I never did go to college. I'm just a natural learner. It's the reason why I was able to start a software company, because I just sat down one day and was like, you know what? I want to make my own plugin. I use a lot of plugins. I want to make my own. And I just sat there and figured it out. So, I'm that style of student. But for this style, maybe consider college, because it can help you create the structure that you need to learn.
What is the definition of a good metal mix?
Definition of good metal mix is clarity. You can hear every single part of the production. You don't have to strain to listen to even the minor details. They're still in there. Powerful, punchy, low end. I know that some of my early work, I go back and I listen to it and I'm like, where's the low end? So low end is very important. And then control the chaos. I mean, when you've got 16th note double kicks and 16th note palm mutes and a bass playing like an octave below that with the same notes, and a screamer that's screaming really low, like, that's a lot of chaos to control inside of the audio spectrum. So I think being able to hear the control of the mix as well is something that I look for. Like, I can tell right away if a mix is messy or if it's controlled. And those are basically the important things that I look for.
Can you achieve a pro sound quality by using plugins only?
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm doing. I think there's plenty of people in the business now that are completely in the box. Outboard gear is still a thing, and I think it always will be, because there's something about what's happening with those components and what's happening with the electricity that you really cannot duplicate with zeros and ones, no matter how granular we get with the resolution of it, no matter how crazy we get with neural networks and AI and all this stuff. Like, it's still never going to actually recreate what's happening in the real world inside of a virtual world, because what's happening in the real world is a lot of physics, a lot of, like, for lack of a better word, a lot of infinity, I'm saying, is happening. And so I guess the other part to look at too is that keep in mind that really all you're doing is you're just recreating, you're recreating voltages that push speakers that just push frequencies out into the air. So there's going to be a huge difference right off the bat from sitting in front of a drum set versus miking that all up, recording that all into data, and then reproducing it out speakers. It's always going to be a completely different sound. So analog gear has the same effect. It's not a drum set, it's not an instrument, but it is an instrument in the sense of how it processes audio. And so I think that they're basically two different things. But if you're talking about like how the world works and how music works as an entertainment medium, obviously we're all listening to playbacks. We're listening to files that have been compressed and are streaming over the internet, things like this. So because of that, like in the box is going to rule them all. It's more convenient, it's faster. You can, anybody can do it. Like you could just go to an Apple store, buy a MacBook and make an album in like an afternoon. Anyone can do that. So because of that, like it's really going to accelerate like the innovations of music and the innovations of music processing and audio processing. So I think absolutely you can make great products with only in the box software. But it's different. It's going to be different than analog, and it'll always be different than analog.
When you can tell that you are ready to work with famous metal bands?
I think you're ready to work with a famous metal band when you are confident in your own ability. And I know that getting to that point is pretty rough. I think it's something you'll always struggle with in your career. Like I still struggle with confidence a little bit. Like there's certain artists that they'll be in the room with me and I'll feel like unsure about some of my decisions. And I think that's only natural. But when you get confident in your ability to basically understand what you're doing, right? Like understand how you're controlling the low end, understand why you're adding the pad in the pre-chorus, understand why you're doing this EQ move to the guitar. That is the confidence that you need to then approach the process of doing this professionally, because that's what the band needs from you, right? Like the band is coming with the songs and with the performance, and you're there to capture it and present it. And when you're confident in your ability to make the decisions necessary to present that performance in the right way, then I think you're ready to do it. Now, there's a whole other side to this, which is essentially the social side, which I think is another thing that takes some time to work on. And that's just being able to like learn how to deal with like, basically humans in general, but know how to deal with their behaviors, know how to deal with like the problems that can come up, even know how to deal with like the psychology associated with performing. I mean, music is emotion, and it can be, there's definitely a type of person out there that wants to just focus on the drums. Like they just want to focus on editing the drums and making the drums sound cool, and they don't think about like how the vocalist feels about the song or how the guitar player feels about their riff or whatever it is. So you have to kind of learn how that works too, because when you start working with a band professionally, you're just kind of thrown into the fire in terms of the psychology of it. And I think after, I've worked with over 100 bands in my career, I feel like I've gotten pretty good at the psychology side of things. And I think that can go really far. You can kind of be like a mediocre mixing engineer, but if you're really good at the psychology of it, you can get clients that'll last for years because they really end up trusting you with their vision, and they end up figuring out how to build a really nice working relationship with you because of that bonding and that relationship that you've built with them from your heart and from your mind. And I think that that's another missing ingredient in some of the aspiring engineers that are coming up today. They kind of don't think about that part of the process. And that's something that really just takes a lot of like getting out there, talking to people, building those relationships, and having people come in the studio and just sort of being thrown into the deep end of having to solve those problems. I've had people literally quit bands like in the middle of the recording and have to figure out like how to deal with that. So, the more of that stuff that comes across your desk, I guess the better you're going to get at it.
Thank you so much, Joey, for such a wonderful chat. It was a huge pleasure talking to you, and it was a huge honor finally meeting you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful opportunity. And thank you so much for all of your wonderful and very knowledgeable videos. And thank you so much for creating Nails the Mix.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.